What's black and white and red all over? It's Bernie Sanders. Okay, Bernie's not black, but still, I'm
His
Scott
heart
Ott,
is.
and this is Right Angle with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green. And gentlemen, Bernie Sanders has a thing or two to say about the newspaper, which I'm sure he uses largely to roll up and swat the dog across the nose with, grumpy old man that he is. He has a column in the Columbia Journalism Review. If this is not the nadir of existence for CJR, I don't know what is. But Bernie has some ideas about what's happening to the American newspaper business. He trots out some statistics, gentlemen, to say in the last 15 years, some 1,400 papers have disappeared or been swallowed up by other entities. Some 28,000 employees of newspapers have lost their jobs since 2008, and I think it was 3,200 of those folks last year. And so Bernie is concerned about the state of American journalism. After all, he says, the existence of local newspapers, for example, has done more to help us as individuals and as taxpayers than anything else. He points to a study that shows that the interest rate that municipalities pay on bonds has actually increased in counties that no longer have a daily newspaper. And the theory there is because the feet of the municipal officials is not being held to the fire, so to speak, and the public is not demanding that they get a better interest rate on their bonds. At least that's what Bernie thinks, and this study seems to say. So, Stephen Green, Bernie has some ideas for how to save American journalism, and they all revolve around the fact that he believes that American journalism of the Woodward and Bernstein, Watergate reporting, Washington Post kind of ilk is being destroyed because of greedy corporations that are buying up and consolidating media entities and allowed to own multiple media entities, radio, TV, and newspapers in a single town. He says, number one, under the Bernie Sanders presidency, we're going to have a moratorium on such mergers until we figure out how they can be done right. We're going to require any applicants for such a merger to disclose possible layoffs before the fact. We're going to give employees the first right to buy out their employer through their employee stock ownership programs. And we're going to stop these mergers that would hurt women and people of color. And he's just getting started. Steve, do you think this is what can finally bring back the grand old days of American journalism?
You know, I read more news than I ever have in my life from a wider variety of sources than I could have ever dreamed of. 25 years ago, when I got three daily papers. No, yeah, I got three daily papers. I got the local, I got the Wall Street Journal, I got the New York Times, and then I got the three major news weeklies, well, two and a half, Newsweek, Time, and U.S. News and World Report being the half. And those are my six major sources of news, plus whatever I could watch on TV when TV was available. But today, I go to Bing News, not Google News. Don't use them. They suck. I go to Bing News, and I get stories from a variety of sources that were just not available to even someone like me who is willing to spend the money that it took back then to get six things brought to my door day after day, week after week. So number one, his premise is absolute crap. There's more journalism going on than has ever been committed, and that whether that's for good or for ill, I'll leave to the viewer to decide. His premise is awful. What he misses are the big daily newspapers in every town that spouted reliable Democratic talking points, or in his case, Democratic-Socialist talking points. What this really reveals is, though, this socialist hubris that there is one best way of doing something, that it's already been done, and that we need the force of government to bring that one way back, and that experts from the top down can figure out the very best way to get this done. And the ideas are also good, of course, that they have to be made mandatory. If I were to use Bernie's logic, I could actually prove to you that newspapers cause bad education, because every big city in this country has a left-leaning newspaper and is run by Democrats and has a crap education system. So, see, there you go, Bernie. If we want to save American education, we've got to close down these harmful big city newspapers.
Make America correlate again. Bill Whittle, Bernie says that some 60% of online ad revenues are sucked up by Facebook and Google. And he points out that according to a recent study by the News Media Alliance, a trade organization, in 2018, as newspaper revenues were declining, Google made $4.7 billion off reporting that Google did not pay for. Can't you at least come alongside of Mr. Sanders on this and say, hey, isn't it in effect revenue is being stolen from these newspapers that in fact they could still be great icons of journalism if it weren't for the fact that these greedy big shot corporations like Google and Facebook are sucking up all their ad revenue?
Well, I think I'm on record for saying that for those journalists who are being fired in record numbers because of these buyouts and failures, learn to code. And as far as Bernie's concerned, I would say learn to typeset. Actually, in Bernie's case, I would say learn to cuneiform, learn to press sharp, pointy sticks into wet molds of clay and then bake them. You can always count on this guy to have the wrong opinion about everything. He's very, very reliable, sort of a weather vane in that regard. To the degree his entire argument falls apart because, like everything else about Bernie Sanders, it was baked in the 60s and it wasn't in the oven long enough. It was kind of half-baked in the 60s. Yes, it is good to have multiple sources of news. Yes, it's good to have a series of local newspapers, but nobody reads newspapers anymore because of this thing called the internet. And so what he's suggesting is the world would be great if we had a source of news that was widespread and differing opinions. That's precisely what we have. That's precisely what caused Hillary Clinton the election. That's precisely what caused Bernie Sanders to get ripped off. It's the mainstream news media that got Bernie Sanders ripped out of the nomination that he could have gotten, or at very least could have gotten a lot closer to. So the guy's just kind of a cranky guy, and he wants everything centralized. That's the thing you can pretty much roundly determine, is that if there's something that's wrong, Steve got it right on the nail. If there's something going on that we can't control, then we need to control it. And obviously the government is the only way to really control things because it's the only element of our society that can use coercive violence to make sure that we all do the things that we're supposed to do. I would just simply take small exception to what Steve said, only because Steve set up his little analogy as an example of a causation without a correlation without a causality. He said every big city has a Democratic newspaper and every big city's got junk education. Therefore, I guess you could tell Bernie that big newspaper is called junk education. But it's not just a causality. It's a direct correlation. He's absolutely right. It's a correlation. The fact is that the America's biggest cities have large left-wing newspapers, and they also have urban situations that are past the third world and violence levels that would be unacceptable in a war zone. And the reason that those zones exist is because the large newspapers in those cities are Democrat. They protect the Democrats who administer these ghettos. They protect the Democrats who continue to make this ghetto life the only option available for people. And it's not just a correlation, it's a causality. It is a big left-wing newspaper in every one of these cities that protects the Democrats and allows them to continue to make these kind of horrific lives for people. So yeah, I'm all in favor of more news sources. I just don't think, and the final irony, not even irony, it's just absurdity is a better word. The very idea that Bernie Sanders thinks that anything can be controlled in the age of the internet is just very, very funny to me. And as we've said many times, I've been saying for 10 years now on and off, maybe it's a wishful hope, but I actually think it's our only chance. This may be the only time in history where the common people have had a chance to talk directly to each other as the elites collapse around us. It's the only time that the regular people manning the walls of the city are able to talk to each other and issue orders or suggestions or commands without having to go through the silk robe priest bastard that's going to go open the gates at midnight and let in, Eric the Red or whatever and bring it into the whole show because he's bored. The ability for regular people to talk to each other the way we're doing now is, I think, the only hope for saving this civilization, and it continues to give me hope, only because it shows how clearly people like Bernie Sanders require a second age, industrial, top-down, must be a multimillionaire, own a huge printing press, distribute to millions of people through large numbers of distribution centers. No, those days are gone. Anybody with an opinion can go out into this infinitely wide plain, infinitely flat plain, and if you've got something interesting to say, people will appear. And that's why we have so few people listening to these particular videos, because it's based on talent, and and you can draw your own conclusions.
You know, I graduated from journalism school in the early 1980s and worked at a local newspaper that then was bought out by Knight Ridder, a chain of newspapers. And I can remember, for the brief time that I was there before they fired me, that we had a meeting to discuss how we were going to computerize layout of the newspaper page. And I can remember sitting there and looking around at my friends who were in this back room where they would typeset the news and then print it out on strips of paper and then that had glue on them. And then they would roll these strips of paper onto this mock-up of the front page of the newspaper and glue it down. And then they would take a picture of that. It was a very time-intensive. I mean, they weren't exactly setting lead type one letter at a time, but it was close to that. And I can remember raising my hand in this meeting and said, no, wait a minute. I think we should be cautious about jumping into this whole computerized page layout, because our friends here, what are they going to do? How are they going to be able to be employed? At which point they patted me on the head and said, go get a sandwich. And I think that what people who are in the journalism business have realized for a long, long time is it's not breaking news from 2019, Bernie Sanders, that money is behind the journalism business. In fact, the whole enterprise exists only because people are willing to risk their money to pay some people to go out and gather some news, to pay some other people to go out and gather some ads. And as we used to joke at our local newspapers, a little 25,000 circulation daily newspaper, and we used to joke that we need just enough news stories so people aren't distracted by the sound of the ads slapping together. And that was, like the news hole was a relatively small part of the paper. And we knew every day when we went out there and filed our stories, we knew every day that many, many people who were getting the newspaper were not buying it to read the news at all, or at least not the hard news. They wanted the sports, they wanted the crossword, they wanted the comics, they wanted the advertising, the classified ads section, they wanted the coupons, they wanted practically everything but the news. So even though I was a starry-eyed journalism student with dreams of becoming the next Woodward and Bernstein combined, I, at the time, knew that my meager pay was coming entirely because this is a business. And Bernie, if you start interfering in the business aspects of this, you're going to find that you're no better off than you were before. And in fact, the reason why your buddy Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post is not so that he could fire all the journalists. It's because he thought it was an enterprise that was worth investing in for a variety of reasons, not only from the public relations value of him owning a newspaper, but also because he could make some money off of it. And that's what you're missing about this whole American enterprise. And one of Bernie Sanders' presidential promises is that he's going to make it easier for newsrooms to unionize so that workers' rights are protected. Well, my comrade, they were unionized, and now they do something else for a living. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members of BillWhittle.com for making this possible.